The Fulton County Court had always been a stage for unchangeable decisions, where the scales of justice rarely tipped to the right side. Judge Eleanor Kirkland reigned there like an absolute monarch, her imposing presence dominating the room with an oppressive silence. For those who entered there as defendants, there was no hope, only a fate sealed before the first argument was heard. But that morning, something was about to change. Marcus Bennett entered the court with firm steps, but not out of arrogance. He knew that that day could define his career, and more than that, it could mean the freedom of a man who should never have been imprisoned. Jamal Rivers was handcuffed in the defendant's dock, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if he had already accepted what was to come. This was not his first unjust trial. It was just another chapter in a story repeated countless times against men like him. But Marcus was not there to accept the inevitable. He had spent years waiting for this opportunity, studying every loophole, every mistake made by Kirkland, accumulating evidence that could finally dismantle the empire she had built on manipulated convictions. What no one knew was that that day, the narrative of the court would change forever. The courtroom benches were packed, but the tension in the air was different. Normally, trials like this went unnoticed, without attracting the attention of the press or the public. But this time, something had changed. Reporters crowded the back of the room, scribbling notes as camera flashes blinked discreetly. The reason? Rumors that Marcus Bennett had something big in his hands. It was not just about the defense of Jamal Rivers, but about the very system that Kirkland had erected over 2 decades. And Marcus was about to expose it. The prosecution began its presentation as usual, confidently, almost boringly, as if it already knew that the sentence had been written. Prosecutor Travis Holden, a young man in an ill-fitting suit with sweat beading on his forehead, read the charges with a trembling voice. He was not an adversary for Marcus. In fact, he seemed more like a puppet. The only true force there was Kirkland, who watched impassively, as if she were witnessing a play she already knew by heart. But Marcus was prepared. When Travis called the first witness, a frail-looking elderly man named Howard Green, Marcus already knew exactly where to aim. Howard Green ascended the witness stand with hesitant steps, his trembling fingers clutching the edge of the seat as he settled in. His wrinkled face showed the expression of someone who wished to be anywhere but there. Travis Holden cleared his throat and began his questioning, trying to lead him into repeating the testimony he had given before. "Do you confirm that you saw the defendant, Jamal Rivers, leaving the convenience store on the night of the crime?" The question echoed in the courtroom, and for a moment, everything fell silent. Howard blinked several times, looking first at Travis, then at Kirkland, and finally at Marcus, who studied him like a chess player waiting for his opponent's move. The answer came hesitantly, laden with uncertainty. I think so. I saw someone." A murmur spread through the room, and Marcus perceived the first crack in the prosecution's case. He leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table, and when it was his turn, he walked slowly to the witness stand. "Mr. Green, you stated that you saw someone leaving the store that night, but are you sure it was Jamal Rivers?" The elderly man swallowed, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, I thought it was him, but it was dark, and everything happened very fast." More murmurs. Kirkland frowned, realizing that something was slipping from her grasp. Marcus paused dramatically and then posed the final question. "Did you receive any kind of incentive to give that testimony?" The courtroom fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant sound of the air conditioning humming at the back of the room. Howard Green's forehead glistened under the artificial light, and he passed a trembling hand over his knees, averting his gaze. Marcus kept his eyes fixed on him, waiting. I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Bennett," the elderly man tried to say, in a voice unconvincing even to himself. Marcus did not press immediately. He opened a folder, took out a printed document, and approached the stand, placing the paper in view of everyone. This is a bank statement from your account, Mr. Green. The day after your initial testimony to the police, a deposit of $5,000 was made. Can you explain where that money came from? The question fell like a hammer over the room. The elderly man shifted again, his eyes scanning the courtroom in search of a refuge that did not exist. Kirkland, until then impassive, pressed her lips into a thin line. "Mr. Green," Marcus insisted in a sharper tone. The elderly man cleared his throat, opened his mouth to speak, and hesitated. The damage was already done. He did not need to answer. The silence said it all. Prosecutor Travis Holden suddenly stood up, adjusting the loose tie, as if trying to regain control of the situation. "Objection, Your Honor!" His voice trembled slightly, and he cast a desperate glance at Kirkland. The judge, however, remained motionless, her fingers interlaced on the podium, as if carefully analyzing the best way to react. But at that moment, the decision was no longer in her hands. The entire courtroom perceived Howard Green's hesitation, the sudden embarrassment of the prosecutor, and above all, the crack that was beginning to widen in the case. Marcus stepped back, crossing his arms. "No problem, Your Honor. I withdraw the question." He knew he didn't need an answer for the truth to become evident. The expression of the jury said it all. Some jurors exchanged glances, others took hurried notes. The seed of doubt had been planted. Jamal Rivers, who until then had kept his shoulders hunched, raised his head for the first time, looking at Marcus as if he saw in him the only light in that suffocating tunnel. Kirkland let out a discreet sigh, but her eyes, once indifferent, revealed a contained irritation. For years, she had had total control of the narrative. Travis Holden tried to recompose the prosecution, but his confidence had already evaporated. He cleared his throat and approached the stand. "Mr. Green, can you, with absolute certainty, identify the defendant as the person you saw that night?" It was a desperate attempt to regain control, but the damage was done. The elderly man looked at the judge, then at the prosecutor, and finally at Marcus. His gaze was that of a cornered man, someone who realized, too late, that he had been used as a pawn in a larger game. I cannot say for sure," he admitted, in a voice barely a whisper. The effect was immediate. A murmur grew among the spectators, and one of the jurors, a short-haired woman with sharp eyes, raised her eyebrows, jotting something down hastily. Marcus turned to Kirkland. "The defense requests that Howard Green's testimony be dismissed, given that he himself admitted not being sure of the suspect's identity." Before Kirkland could respond, Travis was already shaking his head. "That doesn't change the fact that we have security footage." His voice was almost a plea, and Marcus seized the opportunity. "Yes, let's talk about the security footage." He walked to the evidence table and took a silver USB drive. The prosecution presented a single blurry recording, but my team obtained a new angle from the external cameras. And what do they show? He connected the device to the courtroom's audio-visual system, and within moments, the recording began to play on the screen. They show that the man who appears here measures at most 1.75 meter. Jamal Rivers is 188 meter. The silence in the courtroom was almost suffocating. Kirkland's eyes finally wavered. For years, she had ruled that courtroom without being questioned, manipulating proceedings with the precision of a watchmaker. But now, for the first time, irrefutable evidence was beginning to dismantle her empire. Marcus did not need to say anything more. The discrepancy in height was a sentence on its own. The jurors shifted in their seats, absorbing the information. Jamal Rivers kept his gaze fixed on the screen, as if he needed to see to believe that perhaps, finally, the truth was triumphing. Prosecutor Travis Holden scanned the courtroom, seeking support, but found only the crushing weight of reality. "Height can be a matter of perspective," he attempted to argue, but his voice sounded weak. Marcus smiled slightly. "True. Let's test that perspective." He clicked the remote control, and the screen switched to a frozen image from the recording. "Here is the door," of the convenience store. We know that this door is exactly 2 meters tall. With a simple digital stroke, Marcus highlighted the clear difference between the suspect's height and that of the door. As you can see, the math doesn't lie. The man in the video is at least 13 centimeters shorter than Jamal Rivers. A murmur ran through the courtroom, and Kirkland's expression hardened. Kirkland lightly tapped her pen against the podium, a nervous tick that few had witnessed before. She had never needed to react in that way, for she had never felt cornered. But now, the cold, undeniable logic of the evidence was pressing her against the wall. "That is irrelevant," she declared, attempting to maintain control. "The prosecution still has a solid case against the defendant." It was a fragile, almost desperate attempt, and Marcus sensed that it was the moment to strike. He stepped forward, placing his hands on the dark wooden table. "Your Honor, the prosecution has based its accusation on 2 main pieces of evidence: dubious testimony and a recording that, as we have just demonstrated, does not correspond to the defendant. This is not a solid case. It is a judicial error about to occur." Marcus paused, letting his words hang in the air before continuing. "But do you know what is truly irrelevant here? Pretending that this court is still under your control." The room erupted in murmurs. Kirkland leaned forward slightly, her eyes as cold as steel. "Watch your words, Mr. Bennett," she said in a chilling tone. But she knew that she was no longer the only voice that mattered in that room. Travis Holden looked at Kirkland, waiting for an intervention that never came. For the first time, the judge wavered. Marcus perceived that the crack was growing and continued. "For years, this court has condemned men like Jamal Rivers without concrete evidence. But today, before an attentive jury and with journalists recording every detail, this injustice can no longer be swept under the rug." He turned to the jury, meeting each one's gaze. "If you accept this accusation, you will be ignoring the fact that no evidence supports this conviction. None. If you do, you will be signing the sentence of an innocent man." The weight of his words resonated in the room. For the first time in her career, Kirkland failed to interrupt. Her grip on the court began to slip, and the audience noticed. One of the reporters at the back typed furiously. Another already held a phone, probably preparing a last-minute headline. Kirkland straightened her posture, but she did not respond. Marcus continued. "This case is not just about Jamal Rivers. It is about every black man who has passed through this court and left in handcuffs without having committed any crime. But today, something different is happening. Today, people are watching. And for the first time, they are seeing what really happens in here." The courtroom buzzed with tension, and even Kirkland, for the first time in her career, seemed to have lost the firmness she had always maintained. Kirkland took a deep breath, trying to regain the control slipping through her fingers. "This is irrelevant to the case at hand," she declared, her voice laced with contained irritation. But her attempt to divert attention was crushed by reality. The courtroom was no longer the same place where she reigned unchallenged. The jurors no longer looked at her with blind deference. The public, which once maintained resigned silence, now whispered among themselves, sensing that something greater was at stake. It was then that the courtroom doors swung open abruptly. 2 federal agents entered, their expressions impassive and their badges gleaming under the cold light of the room. The murmur transformed into an uproar, and for a moment even Marcus fell silent, watching the scene unfold before him. One of the agents raised a document and walked directly to the podium. "Judge Eleanor Kirkland," he announced, his voice as cutting as a blade. "We have a search warrant and the initiation of a formal investigation into your judicial conduct." The impact of those words was like an explosion. Kirkland turned pale. For the first time, her authority was snatched away without warning, without mercy. The courtroom, which had once been a temple of her unquestionable decisions, now became the stage of her ruin. Kirkland pressed her lips together, trying to maintain her composure, but her eyes betrayed the terror of someone watching their own empire crumble. "This is absurd," she murmured, her voice failing for the first time, but the agents were not there to debate. "Your Honor, we need you to accompany us for the necessary clarifications," one of them said, without a trace of emotion. The absolute silence of the room made every sound amplify. The rustle of papers on the table, the heavy steps of the agents, the contained breathing of the jurors. Marcus remained still, observing everything with the calm of someone who already knew that this moment would come. He looked at Jamal, who was still trying to comprehend what was happening. But then, the words that would change his life were spoken. "Given the scandal of corruption revealed, I move that all charges against Jamal Rivers be immediately dismissed," declared Marcus, his voice firm. The new interim judge, hastily called to preside over the trial, nodded. Motion granted. A metallic click resonated in the courtroom as the handcuffs were removed from Jamal's wrists. He took a deep breath, as if feeling real air for the first time in years. Jamal remained motionless for a few seconds, as if his body had not yet processed freedom. His hands, now free, touched his wrists, feeling the marks of years of injustice. He blinked, looked around, and then found Marcus, who simply nodded in his direction. It was enough. Unable to contain his tears, Jamal let out a nervous laugh, a mixture of relief and disbelief. The courtroom still buzzed, but at that moment, nothing else mattered. He was a free man. As the agents escorted Kirkland out, the public watched with a mix of astonishment and satisfaction. The absolute power of that woman had vanished in a matter of minutes. Her allies avoided her, the courtroom guards no longer met her gaze, and even Travis Holden seemed to question his own decisions. But for Marcus, the battle was far from over. He knew that Kirkland was only one of the many faces of a corrupt system. There would be other cases, other men like Jamal, unjustly imprisoned. But that day, he had proven one fundamental thing: the system can be challenged and defeated. Jamal left the courtroom without handcuffs, yet still felt the weight of stolen years on his shoulders. The sun hit his face, and he closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the feeling of the wind, of freedom. It was strange. After so many years incarcerated, the world seemed different, noisier, more alive. His sister, who had witnessed everything from the gallery, ran to him and embraced him tightly, as if afraid he might disappear again. "It's over," she whispered. But Jamal knew it wasn't that simple. Freedom was only the first step. He would have to rebuild his life from scratch. Marcus watched the scene from afar, arms crossed and a thoughtful expression on his face. He had won cases before, but this was different. It was not just about Jamal. It was about every man who had been silenced in that courtroom. He took his cell phone and without hesitation dialed a number. "We have a lot of work ahead," he said as soon as the call was answered. On the other end, a voice nodded. The Kirkland case was just the tip of the iceberg. But that day, in that moment, he allowed himself to savor the victory. Because for the first time, justice was not an illusion. Elsewhere in the city, in a cold, windowless cell, Eleanor Kirkland sat alone, without her gavel, without her authority, with nothing but the oppressive silence that she once imposed on others. Her name appeared in headlines, her reputation was in ruins, and her allies now treated her like an annoying ghost. Finally, she felt firsthand what so many defendants had experienced in her courtroom: impotence. For the first time in her life, it was not she who dictated the sentence. Meanwhile, outside, Jamal Rivers walked slowly along the sidewalk, feeling the firm ground beneath his feet, feeling the weight of the invisible chains he would still have to break. But he was ready. Marcus Bennett was ready too. Because that day was not only the end of an injustice, it was the beginning of something greater. The beginning of a fight in which, for the first time, the corrupt system knew it could be brought down.